Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched episode 1 of Loki. Let's talk about it. So episode 1 of Loki has finally arrived, one of the most highly anticipated series of the whole year, and oh my goodness, do we have a lot to discuss. But first of all, I did want to start off the review, unfortunately, with some complaining, with a bit of lamenting. Listen, unfortunately, Disney decided to stray from its Friday weekly release programming for this series, because instead of releasing it on Fridays, it switched to Wednesdays, and I don't know why they would do this. I don't know why they would do this to me personally. Like, this is a personal attack on me and my schedule, because Wednesdays is just such a difficult day for me to have to think about Loki. Like, Wednesdays is the middle of the week. I have a normal job. Like, I'm not a YouTuber full time. I don't have time to be filming and editing and posting on Wednesday. Like, that's just not possible. So I was really upset when I saw that it was switching to Wednesdays instead of Fridays. I understand why they're doing that, because they have some upcoming releases that are going to be dropping on Fridays, so they don't want to distract from them. But oh, what a headache, what a nightmare. Okay, so that was my small complaint about the scheduling. We still have the weekly scheduling, and we did see that only one episode dropped today as opposed to the 2 episodes that we saw for WandaVision, and it makes sense because WandaVision was like the 20-minute structure, whereas this series follows that of Falcon and Winter Soldier with its 40+ minute runtime. So I do understand why they're doing this, but I just wanted to complain a little bit because it's such a nuisance. But now that we've gotten the complaining out of the way, let's talk about the first episode of this series. But before we get into that, of course, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, let's dive into my thoughts on episode 1 of Loki. So first of all, this episode picks up right where we left off the last time we saw Loki, which was actually back in Avengers Endgame, which seems like 1,000 years ago at this point. It seems like it was 100 years ago that this film came out. We do get to see Loki back in 2012 when he was attempting to take over Midgard and become the king of Earth. And of course, he was intercepted by none other than the Avengers, who were then also intercepted by the 2018 versions of themselves. So that was a fun little sequence that we saw in Avengers Endgame that we see the continuation of at the beginning of this episode. And we did get to see a few cute moments that weren't in the original Avengers Endgame film. These were likely to be, you know, small little clips that were perhaps left on the cutting room floor. I do feel like that was a very bombastic way to open this episode, because it does directly connect to the MCU films in a way that the other Disney Plus series from Marvel haven't done so. We haven't seen footage of an MCU film yet in the previous Disney Plus series like WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier. We got references to them, largely spoken references or contextual references like with the blip, but we never actually got to see an actual sequence with Tony Stark, with Captain America, and it was kind of jarring to see that in a Disney Plus show. Because of the way that this series was set up, even from Avengers Endgame, it was a very clever way of introducing the idea of the show. I do think it works really well in a very seamless way to introduce the Loki that we will be following in this journey throughout this series. This is 2012 Loki. His only appearance other than in Avengers was in the first Thor film, where he was also the villain. So he's the bad guy, okay? This is not reformed Loki. This isn't Loki who went through a character journey that spanned the course of about 6 years, I believe, for the films, over to, you know, 2017 with Thor Ragnarok. This is a completely different Loki who hasn't quite gotten to that point yet, although we'll talk about how he responds to his journey later on. So I do think it's interesting to have that kind of introduction to the character. And then we do see him, of course, take advantage of the mishap, okay, of the chaos that ensues when the Hulk comes down after after having gone down a ton of stairs, and he's quite upset about it, and Loki ends up with the Tesseract in his hands and makes use of it and disappears off to Mongolia. And we do get that kind of visual callback to the first Iron Man film, where we saw Tony Stark escape from the cave that he was in, held by, I believe it was the 10 rings or the fake 10 rings. I don't know who they ended up being, but he managed to escape and he fell down onto the sand the way that Loki does at the beginning of this episode as well. But in the case of Iron Man 1, he had escaped from capture, whereas Loki is about to be imprisoned, as we see later on. We do see some Mongolian natives stumble across the god of mischief himself, and they're looking at him like, yo, who's this guy? What's he doing here? And he stands up and immediately is trying to start on this spiel about how he's the god of mischief and, you know, they should kneel to him because that's the Loki that we're working with. Except before he can even get to that point in his speech, guess who comes in? The TVA. The TVA interrupted the regular scheduled programming, and this little unit that is on this mission to capture Loki, the variant, is led by none other than my girl, my good sis WHYYY Musaku, who of course was Ruby in Lovecraft Country. If you watched my reviews for Lovecraft Country, you know how much I loved the character that she portrayed in that series. So I was so happy to see her here, and she's leading this mission in a no-nonsense manner. She means business. She is like, I don't have time for your jokes. I don't have time for your games or mischief or your speeches. I'm literally on the clock. So she's able to fight against Loki, and honestly, the fight is over before it even began because she has that kind of TVA technology that's able to slow down the time. He's moving at a 16th of the time when she hits him, and it's just this very comedic effect where you see every single wrinkle, every single wobble of Tom Hiddleston's face in that moment. Then she quickly snaps on that kind of necklace, that kind of choker that they have there in order to kind of capture him and put him under the control of their time manipulation powers, and then they head off back to the TVA. So just like that, we have Loki be captured by the TVA because he is this variant that they are after. Then after this, we get this kind of Loki induction sequence into the TVA where he goes through all of these layers of bureaucracy. He's not quite taking it seriously at this point, and the TVA overall during this sequence looks like a fascinating body. It's very much giving me 1960s vibes. It looks very antiquated, but at the same time, the technology that they use is very advanced. So it's that kind of clash that kind of makes the TVA quite unique. Now, it is very reminiscent of the Umbrella Academy and the Time Bureau there. I can't remember what the Time Bureau is called. I believe the Time Bureau is called the Time Bureau in DC's Legends of Tomorrow, which is another time-related series. But it's interesting to see how this is becoming a subgenre in its own right. But I do feel like the TVA and the Time Bureau from the Umbrella Academy, whose names I can't really remember, does feel distinctively different in that the TVA feels more drab and dreary. It's like the worst part of bureaucracy being emphasized here. The beigeness of it all. The beigeness and brownness of it all. Whereas in the case of the Umbrella Academy, it's the kitschiness that is emphasized. It's the wackiness. And so here you do have a sense that, you know, people do mean business, even though the bureaucracy can be made fun of, the kind of layers of the chain of command can be made fun of, and perhaps the inefficiency as well. But at the same time, even though they might be looking drab and dreary and inefficient, they're out there getting the job done because they're out there resetting the timelines that are disrupted by any variants. So when Loki is going through this induction, he's kind of stripped away of all his Loki-ness, okay? He's stripped away of his Asgardian leather, and it's very interesting to see already. It's kind of a reflection of the way that he will be treated in the TVA, how his mind will be kind of stripped away layer by layer until you get into the inner corners of Loki's psyche, which we'll talk about in a second. There's a lot of psychoanalysis in this episode, which I found fascinating. But in a visual sense, we do see him be stripped away of all things that make him Loki, the green, the Asgardian leather, the gold, and he ends up in this random kind of generic jumpsuit that makes him very much look like the average prisoner with the massive TVA logo there, kind of reminding you visually that he is basically owned by them now. Then you also have this funny sequence sequence where there's this guy, again, yet another layer of bureaucracy, who has this massive pile of papers that is essentially everything that Loki has ever said in his life. Now, I don't know if a god like him, who's like thousands of years old, would be able to fit everything that he's ever said in his life in like just that stack of papers, but fine. Maybe the font is really small. Maybe the font is really small and that's how they managed to get all of his words. But he signs off on that, and then he's sent to yet another layer where there's this kind of metal detector situation, except this time it's to detect if you're a robot, because apparently robots can't be processed in the TVA. You need to be like an organic being. And so one of the TVA workers asks him to declare that to his knowledge he is an organic being and not a robot, and he's just standing there like, whoa, I've never been asked this. Like, what if I am a robot? Like, he's already been bamboozled before. Let's not forget. He thought he was an Asgardian for most of his life until it was revealed that he's actually a frost giant. So my guy might be thinking, like, what if I'm not even a frost giant? What if I'm a robot? So he's going through that machine and he's like, oh, thank goodness. And then you see this kind of image of his aura. There's a lot of red there, perhaps conveying anger, perhaps conveying, you know, just a lot of energy, just a lot of violent energy. I don't know what these aura colors mean personally, but that's how I would interpret it. But then the next stage of Loki's induction is when he goes into this kind of foyer where he's asked to take a ticket, and the guy in front of him refused to take a ticket. He was one of those, do you know who I am people, please? Like, my dad works at Goldman Sachs, please, you're not in the right place for that, okay, my guy? Like, read the room, no one cares. Anyway, Loki's at least smart enough to take a ticket, even though he's skeptical of this whole situation. He's like, let me just take this ticket, put it in my pocket. And then you get this big expositional video by Miss Minutes. Now, Miss Minutes is this cartoon, very, you know, 60s, 50s styled character who's voiced in a very southern kind of stereotypical manner. And she is introducing the purpose of the TVA. Now, really, this introduction is for the benefit of the audience because no one there needs to know this. Essentially, they're headed towards their deaths anyway, so they didn't actually need to know this if you think about it, but it's for the purpose of the audience, because we then can get an understanding of who the TVA are and what they do. Now, during this quaint little animated video, Miss Minutes explains to us in her quirky, stereotypical southern accent that the TVA, or the Time Variance Authority, is a body that was created in order to protect the sacred timeline. Now, the sacred timeline is a timeline that was created by the timekeepers. Now, these timekeepers are these kind of celestial bodies, not to be confused with the actual Celestials from Marvel, but they're these kind of very powerful bodies that existed once upon a time and apparently are still around in the background, although we don't get to see them in this episode. But the TVA is in charge of making sure that that sacred timeline is kept to, and whenever there is a divergence from that timeline caused by a variant, the TVA sends out a unit in order to correct this divergence, bring back the variance so that the sacred timeline can be restored. So that's basically what is explained throughout this video. What I found very interesting though is that there were several words that were used throughout this video that kind of had my ears perking up a little bit. Okay, there was a lot of mentioning of, first of all, the multiverse, because Miss Minutes explains at the beginning that there was this multiversal war that took place, and that's why the timekeepers had to step in the first place in order to kind of gain control of the multiverse, because apparently there was a war for supremacy over the different multiverses, which I found interesting. But then she also mentioned the word madness. She said that the multiversal wars caused madness and disruption in the timeline, and the use of the word madness made me specifically think of course, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, the film that is going to be coming next year. So I don't think that the use of this specific vernacular is an accident. I think that it is supposed to tie into Doctor Strange, the Multiverse of Madness, and I don't think it's an accident either that this series is the first time that we've actually seen footage from an Avengers film, like footage from an actual MCU film, as opposed to just referencing to them, because I do think that having that kind of tying in together, Avengers Endgame, where we saw the Ancient One herself when she was, you know, talking about how removing one of the Infinity Stones from the timeline would end up disrupting it. We'll talk about that in a second. But the idea that you would tie that in directly into this series, as well as, of course, using these kind of verbal cues for Doctor Strange 2, definitely gives me the sense that this might tie directly into Doctor Strange 2 the way that WandaVision did, but through the character of Wanda specifically, as opposed to the whole storyline. If you were to ask me how specifically this series is going to tie into Doctor Strange 2, that's where, you know, I'm not quite as sure, okay? I do feel like it's perhaps possible that by the end, Loki would have caused such a disruption in the sacred timeline that we might end up with a multiverse war that is explored in Doctor Strange 2. Perhaps it leads into Spider-Man as well, because we already know that those two films will be connected due to the different Spider-Men that will be making an appearance. So I'll be interested to see if this series ends up being a very integral entry into phase 4, more so than we ever even saw coming, because of this tie into the Multiverse of Madness. After Loki goes through this foyer, we do see him entering a courtroom. So apparently that previous room was just a waiting room for the court, for the trial, I guess, that Loki has. Now he stands in front of a judge, and this judge is portrayed by Gugu Mbatha-Raw. Very happy to see these British actresses making an appearance in the MCU. Super excited. British actresses of colour as well. Listen, I wasn't going to bring it up. I was always going to bring it up. I wasn't going to bring it out, but yeah, the evidence is there. And of course, Loki has to stand trial for the fact that he's a variant, and he lists off a ton of other things that he's guilty of, but being a time variant just isn't one of them. And he does build up to this dramatic moment where he plans on having his knives, okay? He plans on having his knives shoot out the way that they often do. We've seen him do this trick often in the Thor films, but unfortunately for Loki, the move flops. Like, he's not able to do anything. Everyone's chuckling in the room. It's a very awkward situation for him, because apparently magic doesn't work in the TVA. So now we're thinking like, wow, magic doesn't work in the TVA. They're able to manipulate time. They control, you know, time variances. What's going on here? What is this body that looks so outdated, so bureaucratic, but is actually so powerful? Now we do see behind the judge herself that there are these 3 imposing figureheads, literal figureheads behind her, and they seem to represent the timekeepers themselves that created the sacred timeline that the TVA is designed to keep. I have seen people online discussing how there could be ties to Kang the Conqueror, who is actually an upcoming Ant-Man villain who's going to be portrayed by Jonathan Majors, another Lovecraft Country alumni, okay? But I'm not sure about the direct link between them. Listen, we're not going to Mephisto the situation again. We're not doing that again. Speaking of Mephisto, he'll be coming back too for a second, but we're not doing that again, okay? I'm just going to mention it here, and then if it ends up being Kang the Conqueror, then at least I said something. But if not, then we can swiftly move on. But before the judge does decide that Loki is guilty and sends him off to be reset, aka killed, which again, is that what they're doing everywhere? Like, I'm not sure on that front. We do see the entrance of none other than Agent Mobius. Now, we did see him previously in another scene, which we'll talk about in a second, but he manages to save Loki, not out of the kindness of his heart, but because he believes that Loki can be very useful to him because of his other mission, which seems to be far more important than the mini mission that Hunter B-15 was on. So Mobius takes Loki through the TVA to this room, but before we arrive to this room, we do see the kind of hallways of the TVA, and we are able to get a shot of the overall kind of offices. Like, what would that even be called? It's just this other pocket dimension, and it seems to be structured, funnily enough, as though it's like the cogs of a clock. That's a really fun and clever way of tying in the idea of time in the TVA, of course, being the guardians of time, basically. But yeah, the whole structure, it just looked very busy. It looked very confusing, but it very much looked like the intricate, tiny parts of a watch. And even throughout the TVA as well, you do see a lot of circles circles. That's kind of a big motif in the offices. Again, I don't know what this building would be called, and I do feel like that ties in directly to a clock face. On top of that, I do think it ties in directly into the 60s aesthetic and the geometric aesthetic that we see during that period as well. As I said, after they pass through the hallways, they finally end up in the room that Agent Mobius wanted to take Loki to, and it turns out it's this kind of viewing room for basically his entire life. Like, you know the phrase, I watched my life flash before my eyes? Well, Loki gets to see his life play out in 4K. Well, actually, it's not even 4K, it's like 360p. Like, it's not, the quality isn't great. Okay, this is again 60s technology, but also not, like, also very much enhanced, so it's quite a bizarre mix. But we do get to see Loki's life play out on this screen, and the first sequence that he sees is one that he's very familiar with because he very recently lived it. It is, of course, the events that took place in 2012's Avengers, where we see him get defeated by the Avengers, and he's kind of looking away like, guys, like, give me a break. By the way, just up front, this is Loki's worst day ever. Like, this whole day, this whole sequence of events, he woke up, tried to take over the world, got defeated by his brother and some other goons in his eyes, the Avengers. He got busted up by the Hulk. That was traumatizing for him, as we saw in Thor Ragnarok. And then you get to the point where he's almost like having a bright spot in his day. He's almost getting away with the shenanigans. You know, even though he didn't manage to become king of Midgard, at least he would make a great escape. But no, he couldn't even make a run for it because the TVA caught up with him and they're trying to diminish his status as a god. And then they show him the sequence of events that just played out, and it only gets worse from here. Like, this is Loki's worst day ever. At the end of this day, Loki is tired. He's having an existential crisis. He's questioning every single decision he's ever made and his purpose on Earth. And I think it's very deliberate, of course, that this episode is called Glorious Purpose, because that's one of the biggest questions that Loki has by the end of this entire induction day is, what is my purpose then, if what I believe to be my purpose was completely false? Not only completely false, but completely meaningless. We get to see the scene play out from the first Avengers film, but this time around Mobius is trying to get an understanding of what Loki is actually thinking, like what was going through Loki's mind during the sequence of events. Why did he want to impose such violence on the people of Earth? Why did he want to rule Earth in the first place? He's just trying to decode him, and this very much reminded me of WandaVision. Speaking of that episode, I believe it was episode 8, where Agnes was going through time, like literally going through time through Wanda's greatest hits. As she tried to get an understanding of why Wanda would create the hex to begin with, because as it is determined by the end of the episode, she was the creator of the hex. She is the Scarlet Witch. And so there's very much a parallel here where Mobius is trying to get an understanding of Loki's psyche and trying to understand why he was doing the things that he did. But Loki again is very arrogant during this whole sequence, banging on about how he's a god and how this was a kindness to the people of Earth, because, you know, one of the biggest and greatest lies that has ever been told is that of freedom, which brings us to a theme that I found fascinating for this series that gets me very, very excited for what will be explored in the rest of these episodes, because we do have the mentioning of the destiny versus free will debate, otherwise known as predeterminism versus free will. I find this so fascinating. Already I was fascinated by the psychoanalysis of Loki. We've seen a lot of psychoanalysis of characters in the MCU through the Disney Plus shows, as I said, in the case of WandaVision, but also in the case of Bucky from Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and now with Loki. It seems as though if you want to get a therapist, if you want to get some psychoanalysis, okay, some couch time with a therapist, Disney Plus is the way to go. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because Disney Plus series have the time to allow for the exploration of the mental health of the psyche of these characters. I absolutely love the fact that these series are actually taking advantage of the added runtime that they have in order to fully delve into this. But yes, going back to the predeterminism debate, I do find it very interesting how Loki seems to simultaneously agree with predeterminism but also not, because it seems as though, at least from what he says, he believes believes that there are certain people who should have their destiny determined for them by a greater power, but there are others, a small selection that he's conveniently a part of, that should have that autonomy over their lives and over what they do throughout their lives, because he doesn't believe that the TVA has the power to determine what should become of him, what his purpose is on this universe. He staunchly believes that every single decision that he has made throughout his journey has been his and his alone. He tried to take over Earth because he wanted to, not because some supreme powers, the timekeepers or whatever, decided that that was what he was supposed to do. That's something that he is vehemently against, while simultaneously believing that the people of Earth needed that kind of guidance, needed that freedom, the illusion of freedom, to be ripped away from them, because it would have made things easier for them in his eyes. So I find that very interesting. It's the hypocrisy, right? It's the hypocrisy of it all, for him to think because he's a god, because he has this kind of, you know, perception of himself as being a god, untouchable, someone who's not on the same level as the Midgardians, he doesn't deserve that kind of autocratic treatment in the way that the Midgardians would under his hand. It's very, very interesting and very, very clever to kind of bring this character through that psychological analysis. But this is a massive debate in philosophy overall, and I'm so happy that this series is exploring that and going with this angle. I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on predeterminism. Like, what do you think? Like, do you think there is such thing as destiny, or do you think that as human beings we have full control, free will over our lives? Let me know down in the comments below. Start up a debate if you'd like to. Whilst Loki goes on this tirade, Mobius doesn't try to stop him. He's actually encouraging it. He's actually trying to rile him up a little bit by contradicting what he's saying and poking holes in his logic, which I absolutely love. I think Mobius is a fascinating character. We'll talk about him in a second, but I do love the chemistry that he has with Tom Hiddleston's Loki. I feel like he's a match for him mentally. Like, he can see through Loki's nonsense, basically the lies that Loki tells, the stories that he's spinning, and of course he can see through the sense of grandeur that Loki is trying to convey in this scene. So I love that kind of interaction, the tension that exists between these characters. Unfortunately, before Mobius can really dig in deep and make that breakthrough, he is interrupted by Hunter B-15, who tells him that yet another unit has been lost to the big variant, the big bad that Mobius is actually trying to pursue. And even though he tells Loki to stay where he is, we know we know that's not gonna happen. Like, of course Loki was gonna take the first opportunity that he could in order to leave. So yeah, that's exactly what happens, and he ends up getting apprehended, of course, but that's not before he ends up in some kind of office where he finds one of the workers in the TVA from earlier, who had kind of signed him in and taken in the Tesseract that had been in his hands when he had arrived. Now it turns out that this Tesseract ended up in like some drawer, like in some desk, and in the desk we see just a smattering of Infinity Stones. Infinity Stone. First of all, this scene is much more significant than you think, because we have the confirmation that not only does the multiverse exist, like we've been knowing this, but also that the Infinity Stones exist in each multiverse, but also the Infinity Stones that made up the culmination of like 10 years of storytelling in the MCU, the Infinity War saga that we were all so invested in for a decade, that we saw the culmination of in Avengers, Infinity War and Endgame, were basically meaningless. Turns out the stones don't mean anything. Okay, they're not worth much because there are Infinity Stones in every single multiverse. So like the TVA doesn't even care about that sort of thing. Those powers of this Infinity Stones don't even work in the TVA. So they're literally being used as paperweights. They're literally being used as paper. Like, we are all embarrassed in that moment. We are all low-key just embarrassed as hell for being so invested in the Infinity Stones. Loki wasn't just embarrassed though. He was like defeated. But then he finds out that this thing that he was working towards, trying to get the Infinity Stones, you know, trying to work with Thanos, you know, cooperating with Thanos, except he wasn't really, because he planned to betray him, all of that never mattered, Because the Infinity Stones aren't worth anything when there's a billion of them, like an infinity of them in all of these different multiverses. And to see the way that the TVA treated the Infinity Stone, the thing that he almost died over, it was just like an existential crisis for Loki. And again, it goes back to what I said. This is Loki's worst day ever. I believe it's after this sequence that Loki does end up returning to the kind of viewing room where he watches the rest of his life play out. And in this sequence, I think Tom Hiddleston was doing the actoring because you could see all of the emotions be reflected on his face as he watched the sequence of events play out that were his entire life, or at least the remainder of his life. We saw the sequence in Thor the Dark World, but as well as Thor Ragnarok. It was so touching to see his reaction to how Thor was kind of praising him and acknowledging that Loki isn't all bad, that he has goodness inside of him. And of course you have that final moment where he sees himself be killed by Thanos, and all you hear is the neck snap. Like, you don't even see the scene again. You see Loki's reaction, okay, this close-up of his face, and you hear the neck snap, and it's just, oh. And so by the end of this day, Loki has just been through it, and you can see in his posture, in his mannerisms, the kind of bravado, the kind of pompous attitude that he came into the TVA with has just dissipated because he's gone through an existential crisis. He's seen his mother die. He's seen himself die. He's seen himself die just mere moments after he experienced a character arc, a character journey that he can't even relate to, but he clearly would have loved to see for himself in person. It's just all too much. And so you just see him sitting there on the floor, and when he finally speaks to Mobius at this point, it seems as though this is the first time we're seeing the real Loki. We're stripping away again the Asgardian leather, okay, the pompous attitudes, the, you know, false sense of superiority, and he finally reveals to Mobius that he doesn't like hurting people. He doesn't actually enjoy inflicting pain. It's just part of the illusion. And I think this is kind of a nice parallel to what he was saying earlier about the TVA, about them being an illusion to a sense of superiority and to a sense of power that they don't actually have in order to bring fear to the weak. Well, this time around, he points to himself when he refers to himself as being weak and as being the source of an illusion in order to create a sense of superiority and power that he doesn't actually have and that he doesn't actually feel. And I think that was just such a profound moment for this character, especially when you consider the place that he's in his character journey, where he just found out that he is a frost giant. He was having those identity issues in the first Thor film, and his initial reaction was just to act out in anger and frustration with Odin. But then after seeing his life play out, he's just brought down to this sense of like sadness and reflection. And yeah, it seems as though he's been broken down enough by Mobius and by the TVA to cooperate with them. That is essentially the point at which this episode was designed to bring this character to, is to a point where he would cooperate with the TVA in order to kind of go on this journey so that they can take down the variant, who it turns out is actually him, but an alternate version of him. So now let's go through Mobius' side story, his little side quest, because he was introduced initially in this episode in a first scene which took place in the 16th century in France, and there seems to have been a variant who has just gotten loose, and they've taken with them one of those devices that the TVA have in order to reset everything. And it's when he is kind of looking around trying to find clues to who was there that someone makes an appearance in the church, and they're on high alert until Mobius realizes that it's just a child. And they walk up to this child and they try to ask them, like, you know, what happened here? Like, what was going on? And the child just points to the picture. The child points to the picture of the devil. Listen, Okay, I refuse to go down the Mephisto route. No. Like, we've done this before. We've been here before. We're not doing it again, okay? I think in this instance, the devil is Loki, because if you take a look, a really close look at the actual image of the stained glass window, he seems to be dressed in green and gold. So of course that's Loki's color palette. So it makes sense that that would be Loki from a different dimension. And also what's fun is that, you know, the devil is kind of sticking out his tongue in this image, and his tongue is blue. And that kind of ties in perfectly to the blue bubble gum that the child was given. That's kind of an anachronistic object that was given to the child by the variant. So I do feel like it was a very interesting image to have there, the idea that Loki would be portrayed as the devil. I think it was interesting to see the devil be portrayed in a stained glass window in a church to begin with. Like, I've been to many a Catholic church, never seen images of the devil in a stained glass window. There's usually just Stations of the Cross or some saints, okay? There's never the devil. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe it was Loki's doing to begin with, so fine, let's explain it that way. But yeah, so that's the kind of sequence that introduced the character of Mobius and his mission, and so we get a better understanding of why he was interrogating Loki to begin with, because it turns out that the variant that he is after, the big bad that he is after, is another version of Loki. Now, here's the theory time. Theory time, okay? This is very early on in this series, so, you know, we haven't really gotten a lot of information yet, but I think that this may be Lady Loki. I think it may be the female version of Loki, who's the big bad. I haven't watched the second episode. I know that reviewers, big channels, managed to get 2 episodes of the show to review before the first one came out, so this is just purely a guess, but that's the way that I would go. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on episode 1 of Loki, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch your videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!